The dungeon was a sprawling maze of cold stone walls, dimly lit corridors, and dangerous creatures lurking in every shadow. For centuries, it had been sealed, a place where only the bravest or most foolish adventurers dared to venture. But today, it wasn't a band of heroes that was making its way through the dark tunnels. It was a single human, alone and out of place. His name was Marcus, clad in ragged clothes and equipped with nothing but a crude sword and a torch. He looked like any other unfortunate soul sent to die in the dungeon's depths. But Marcus was not an ordinary prisoner. Unlike the countless others who had fallen to the traps, monsters, and magical wards, Marcus was determined. He had one goal: to escape this cursed place and show the world that a human could survive what was meant to be a death sentence. The dungeon was home to many race goblins, orcs, and other worldly creatures that guarded their domains fiercely. Marcus had seen many fall to their claws and teeth. His fellow prisoners, men and women alike, had screamed in terror as they were dragged into the darkness. But Marcus kept moving, not letting fear overtake him. He had grown used to the weight of silence and the unsettling sound of distant growls. For him, the dungeon had become less of a terrifying prison and more of a challenge, a puzzle waiting to be solved. His strength wasn't in his size or brute force. He was average in height, lean from days without proper food, and his arms were tired from constant battles. But what Marcus had, that none of the dungeon's denizens could match, was his sheer human willpower. Each step he took, he learned studying the creatures, understanding their weaknesses, adapting to the ever-changing environment. On the surface, humans were underestimated, seen as fragile, weak, and incapable of the same feats as other beings. Marcus had always heard stories of how humans weren't suited for the dungeon's horrors, but no one told him that. He refused to believe he was incapable. He had outwitted a goblin horde by luring them into a series of traps meant for him. He had narrowly avoided the deadly fangs of a massive basilisk by hiding in its blind spot and using its own movement against it. When he encountered an orc chieftain, larger and stronger than anything he had seen before, Marcus didn't fight head-on. He used the terrain, setting up a rock slide that buried the brute under tons of rubble. As days turned into weeks, Marcus became a legend whispered among the dungeon's creatures, the human who couldn't be stopped, the one who fought with cunning rather than strength, who survived where many others had perished. Deep in the dungeon, in the heart of its labyrinthine structure, Marcus found what he had been searching for: a door. Not just any door, but a massive, ancient gate covered in runes, pulsating with dark magic. It was the dungeon's final trial, the last barrier that kept him from freedom. As he approached, a voice echoed in his mind, a deep and ancient voice that had been there since the beginning. "Turn back, human," the voice warned. "No one passes through here. You will die like all the others." Marcus stood before the door, gripping his sword tightly. "I've faced everything this place has thrown at me. I'm not dying here." With a determined step, he raised his sword and plunged it into the ground. The dungeon began to rumble. The creatures that had once hunted him fled in terror. The ancient runes shattered, and the door slowly creaked open. On the other side, sunlight poured through. Marcus, battered and bruised but unbroken, took a deep breath of the fresh air. He had done it. He had escaped the dungeon, something no human or any other creature had ever done before. As he stepped out into the world, Marcus smiled to himself. He wasn't just a human from a dungeon. He was a survivor, a fighter, and proof that no matter how weak others might think you are, a human's resolve could overcome anything. The legend of the human from the dungeon would spread far and wide, inspiring others to challenge their limits. And Marcus, he was just getting started. The sunlight felt strange against Marcus' skin. After weeks, maybe even months, of being confined to the dungeon's dark and damp corridors, the warmth of the sun was both foreign and welcoming. He stood at the edge of the exit, staring into the vast wilderness that lay beyond the dungeon's entrance, a lush forest, teeming with life. Birds chirped in the distance, the wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus allowed himself to smile. But his relief was short-lived. As Marcus stepped into the world beyond in the dungeon, he realized he was not alone. The clearing in front of him was filled with vigorous armored warriors, mages in flowing robes, and strange creatures he had never seen before. At the center of the gathering was a massive tent, and standing before it was an Aliyun commander, her piercing green eyes locked on Marcus. "Is that a human?" one of the soldiers muttered. "He came from the dungeon," another whispered, wide-eyed. The UN commander stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Impossible," she said, her voice sharp. "No human has ever left the cursed place alive." Marcus, still clutching his worn sword, stared back at her. His body was weary, his muscles ached from battle after battle, but his spirit remained unbroken. He had survived too much to be intimidated now. "Yet here I am," Marcus replied, his voice steady. The elves and their allies exchanged glances. It was clear that Marcus' presence was unexpected. For years, the dungeon had been a place of horror and legend. Entire armies had ventured inside, only to be lost to its twisted depths. That a lone human had emerged from it was nothing short of miraculous or dangerous. The UN commander narrowed her eyes. "How did you survive the dungeon? What magic did you use?" Marcus shook his head. "No magic, just grit, determination, and a bit of luck." The crowd murmured in disbelief. To survive the dungeon without magic, it was unheard of. But Marcus wasn't interested in convincing them. He had seen enough during his time in the dungeon to know that actions spoke louder than words. "What do you plan to do with me?" Marcus asked, his grip on the sword tightening. He had no intention of becoming a prisoner after escaping one. The commander studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "We were here to seal the dungeon, to prevent its dark magic from spreading further into our lands. But you've done the impossible. The council will want to see you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The council?" "The High Council of Offerin," the commander replied. "They govern the realms. If you've truly escaped the dungeon, they'll want to know how. You may have knowledge of what lies within, knowledge that could change the balance of power in these lands." Power. That word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus had never sought power. All he wanted was freedom. But now, it seemed like his actions had thrust him into the middle of something far bigger than himself. "I didn't come here for politics," Marcus said, his voice hard. "I just want to live my life." The commander tilted her head slightly. "That may no longer be possible. Whether you like it or not, you've become part of a larger story." Marcus sighed, glancing at the forest beyond. The idea of disappearing into the wild was tempting. He had always been a lone wolf, more comfortable with survival than with diplomacy. But something told him that running wouldn't solve anything. The dungeon's influence was spreading, and if the council was involved, there were forces at play that he didn't yet understand. "Fine," Marcus said after a long pause. "I'll go with you, but if this council tries anything, I'm out." The commander gave a slight nod. "Agreed, but be warned, human, the council is not to be trifled with. They will see you as both a curiosity and a threat." As Marcus was led toward the encampment, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. The dungeon had been a crucible, a test of his endurance and cunning, but whatever lay ahead would be even more dangerous. He had faced monsters, traps, and ancient magics, but now he was entering a world of politics and power, struggles and where being human made him both an outsider and a wild card. The elves provided Marcus with fresh clothes and food. He ate in silence, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. His body was still scarred from his battles, but those wounds were nothing compared to the scars that had formed in his mind. He had seen death and danger in every corner of the dungeon, and yet here he was, alive. The next morning, they set off for the capital of Offerin. As they traveled through the forests and across rivers, Marcus saw the signs of a world on edge. Soldiers patrolled the borders, fortifications were being built, and refugees whispered of an impending war. Something dark was coming, something that had been brewing for years, and somehow, Marcus was now part of it. He had thought that escaping the dungeon would be the end of his story, but as the towering walls of Oftherin's capital came into view, Marcus realized it was only the beginning. The human from the dungeon wasn't just a survivor, he was a symbol, and whether he liked it or not, his actions would shape the future of the realms. The capital city of Offerin was nothing like Marcus had imagined. Towering spires of marble reached into the sky, glistening with magic-infused light. The streets were filled with people of all race, elves, dwarves, even creatures Marcus had never seen before, all moving with purpose, their faces etched with concern. Marcus felt out of place here, a simple human who had survived the dungeon by sheer force of will, and yet, all eyes seemed to be on him. The IUN commander led him through the streets, toward the grand hall where the High Council convened. As they walked, whispers followed Marcus like a shadow. That's him, the human who escaped the dungeon. Impossible, no one survives that cursed place. What could this mean for us? Marcus ignored the murmurs, focusing on what lay ahead. He had been through worse far worse. If he could face down the horrors of the dungeon, he could face a council of politicians. The doors to the council chamber swung open with a groan, revealing a massive room with a circular table at its center. Seated around it were the most powerful leaders of the realm's elven lords, dwarven kings, and other influential figures. At the head of the table sat a figure cloaked in shadows, a powerful Mogger by the look of their glowing staff. "Step forward, human," the voice from the shadows commanded, its tone filled with ancient authority. Marcus walked into the center of the room, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. He could sense the tension in the air. The council wasn't just curious about him, they were afraid of what he represented, a shift in the balance of power. "You've escaped the dungeon," Amaga said. "No one has ever returned from that place alive. How did you manage it?" Marcus shrugged. "I learned, I adapted, I fought." The council members exchanged glances. His answer was simple, but they understood the truth behind it. It wasn't magic or power that had kept Marcus alive, it was the relentless determination that was unique to humans, the will to survive against all odds. The Dwarven King leaned forward, his beard braided with silver rings. "The dungeon is ancient," he said in a gravelly voice. "It was sealed long ago, its dark magic buried to protect the realms. If you escaped, that means something inside has changed. Something has awakened." Marcus' mind raced. The dungeon had felt like it was alive, constantly shifting, as if it were testing him, but he had never thought much about what lay deeper within its depths. He had been too focused on survival to consider the larger picture. "The dungeon is not just a prison," the Mogger said, rising from their seat. "It is a gateway, a seal that keeps something far more dangerous locked away. And now, with you escaping, that seal has weakened." A chill ran down Marcus' spine. "What are you saying?" The IUN commander stepped forward, her face grim. "Escaping, you may have inadvertently triggered something. There are dark forces that have been waiting for this moment. The world could be facing a new threat that not even the council is prepared for." Marcus clenched his fists. He had fought so hard to escape, to find freedom, but now it seemed like his escape had unleashed something far worse. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked. The Mogger's eyes glowed beneath their hood. "You know the dungeon better than anyone. You've survived its trials, faced its creatures, and lived to tell the tale. We need you to return." "Return," Marcus echoed, disbelief in his voice. "You want me to go back into that hellhole?" "Not alone," the Dwarven King said, rising to his feet. "You've proven your strength, human, but you'll need allies this time. The forces that lie within the dungeon are growing, and if they are unleashed, the entire world will fall." Marcus stared at the council, feeling the weight of their words. He had wanted nothing more than to be free, to live a life outside the dungeon's walls. But now, it seemed that his fate was tied to the very place he had fought so hard to escape. "I'm not a hero," Marcus said, his voice low. "I'm just a survivor." The IUN commander stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "Sometimes, survival is enough. Sometimes, that's exactly what makes you a hero." Marcus felt the exhaustion of his journey settle into his bones, but at the same time, something inside him stirred. The same fire that had kept him alive in the darkest corners of the dungeon now flickered to life once more. He had faced death and despair, and he had come out stronger. Perhaps this time, he could do more than just survive. Perhaps this time, he could fight for something greater. He took a deep breath, his mind made up. "All right," he said, "I'll go back, but I'm going to need more than just a sword and a torch this time." The Mogger nodded, a hint of a smile on their lips. "You'll have what you need, but be warned this time. The dungeon won't just be testing your strength, it will be testing your resolve, your very soul." As Marcus turned to leave the chamber, the council erupted into quiet discussion. He could feel the weight of their hopes and fears resting on his shoulders, but for the first time since his escape, he didn't feel alone. He had allies now, and though the path ahead was dark and dangerous, Marcus was ready to face it. The dungeon had tried to break him once, but now he was going back on his own terms, and this time, He wasn't just going to survive, was going to win.